Hey there, welcome to God Speaks Today. My name is Andy Croft and I work for a church in Watford called Soul Survivor. And part of this series is looking at passages of the Bible and seeing how they speak with such relevance for our lives today. And the thing I want to look at today is forgiveness. And I want to start by reflecting on the whole understanding and notion of story, because this is really important when it comes to understanding forgiveness today. Facebook have recently started advertising, and I saw this advert that they put out that was mainly about sport, and then right at the end you realised it was an advert for Facebook. But what they were saying in the advert is, isn't it great to share stories and to tell stories about kind of matches that we watched, and so we'll all watch a sports match, maybe in separate places, and then we'll come together and we'll tell stories about games to people who've watched the exact same game, and we'll relive it together. And that's true in all sorts of areas of life, isn't it? So we do the same when we're having a meal together in a great restaurant. I'll eat my food and I'll tell you a story about my food, and then you eat and try my food and you tell me exactly the same thing about my food. And in doing that, we're sharing experiences, and there's a joy that comes from that. And when we get together at church, we do exactly the same thing. We're getting together with people that know God, and we're all talking to each other about the God that we already know. But in telling the same stories to each other again and again and again, it becomes real and it becomes alive. And the best story that we could ever tell is the story of the gospel, the good news. And in understanding this, we understand forgiveness in a whole new light. And I just want to, there's lots of places we could go in the Bible to talk about this, but I want to pick up a passage that we're going to read in Matthew chapter 18. And in this chapter, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, is coming to him. He's obviously just been annoyed by somebody. So he's got this question about forgiveness. And he says to Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive somebody? And the standard teaching of the day from other religious teachers would be 3 times. But Peter knows Jesus is a very generous, kind, compassionate person. So he throws out 7 times, as if that's like a huge number. How many times must I forgive somebody if they sin against me? 7 times? And then Jesus tells him a story in response to that question. So verse 22 of chapter 18 says this. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And the point there is not that it's literally 77 times. So it's like, I've forgiven you once, I've forgiven you twice, I've forgiven you 63 times, you've only got a few left. That's not the point. The point is just a really big number, more times than you can count, Peter. And then he illustrates this point by going on. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, sometimes in the Bible, when we read it, if you notice, they have like a little detail at the bottom, and that can help you understand it in context. So in the bottom of my Bible, it says this is 10,000 talents, and then it's got a little bit about how much a talent was worth. But based on today, what an average yearly wage would be, I figured out that 10,000 talents would be a modern day equivalent of 5.2 billion pounds. So that's an awful lot of money. So this guy owes him 5.2 billion. Since he was not able to pay, go figure, the master ordered he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. And if 10,000 bags of gold is 5.2 billion, 100 silver coins would be 7,000 pounds roundabout. And yes, that's a lot of money, but not in comparison. He finds this guy who owes him the equivalent of 7,000 pounds. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And so you can just imagine, can't you, what it must have been like for that servant as he's standing there, the guy that owes that massive debt, in the king's court, waiting to appear before the king. The king's settling his accounts before him, so he's seeing everybody else go up and get settled, and some of them would have been able to pay probably, maybe other ones would have been sold into slavery. And you're standing, can you imagine if you're standing there, and you know that you owe this king £5.2 billion, and you haven't got it? How are you going to be feeling? You're going to be feeling absolutely terrified. You would be sweating, your pupils would be dilating, you would really need the toilet, but it would be like a serious thing because you also know that your family is going to be sold into slavery. Your wife is not going to be happy when she finds out that she's about to get sold as a slave. And when you have debt, it's a crippling thing. It's always playing at the back of your mind. So you would just feel this crushing anxiety as you stand there. And you know the way the king deals with people because you've seen him do it. You know that he's always fair and he's always just, but he collects what he's owed. And so suddenly you're there standing right in front of him and he's staring at you and he says, "Where is my £5.2 billion? And you say, "I haven't got it." And he says, "Well, in that case, I'm going to sell you into slavery." And at that point, you start begging. You say, "You know you're never going to get 5.2. Where are you going to find that? Have you got some stock options you can cash in? You haven't got any money." So you're just playing for time, but you say, "Please, please give me some time and I'll get you the money." And imagine if you're there on your knees in front of him and suddenly this look, that's kind of a look of kindness, just comes over his face. And he looks at you and he says, "All right, I'll tell you what, not only will I give you more time, I will cancel this debt totally. We'll just wipe it clean. We'll wipe the slate clean." And you get up off the floor and you walk out and the whole thing has been taken away. How would you feel in that moment? In order to understand the story of Christianity, there's a number of kind of phases, really. Not many, but a couple. The first one is this. It's understanding that we owe an enormous debt, like this massive amount. And the word that's used sometimes is the word sin. And the word sin, we don't always realize, I think today, I don't sometimes, how serious sin is, because we've taken that word and we've applied it to either people that just do totally horrific and terrible things, or to stuff that's just a little bit naughty. So I'm going to have some Ben & Jerry's this evening, I'll be sinning this evening. And we make it into this, either this horrific thing or this really light thing. And what that allows us to do psychologically is it means it doesn't really apply to us in a serious sense. So when we think sin is just what people do that's horrific over here, we think, well, there's a line somewhere, and there's bad people on that side of the line, and then there's good people on this side of the line, and I'm on the good side of the line. That's how we approach it. But what the Bible shows us when we look at ourselves, almost like when we use it as a mirror, is it shows us that the line between good and evil doesn't run between us and them as much as we would like it to. It shows that it runs right down the center of every single person, that all of us have a debt that we owe to God. And to live in sin is not just to indulge in something like ice cream. It's to live apart from God. It's to live totally selfishly for ourselves. We want to live in our own way. And all of us do that to an extent. And there are consequences to that. So it says in Romans chapter 6 that the wages of sin is death. We see the consequences of that in our own lives. Sometimes I don't like to use the word sin for myself, but I can see the effects of the way that I'm living on my own life and on the lives of the people around me. So one of the consequences of sin is because we become wrapped up in ourselves, we find it hard to love other people. Our propensity to love, our capacity for love can become frozen. Like if you were to take a heart and stick it in the freezer and slowly it was to stop beating and just become hard. We can become frozen. Another example would be we sometimes struggle to enjoy other people. To love God is to love other people. And if we're apart from God, then sometimes we struggle with the loving people bit. And so we can begin to see other people as threats, as competition, not as someone to enjoy. We can become insecure in our own way and think no one can ever really love us. So there are consequences to living apart from God. And to ignore those is to make a big mistake. It would be like me saying, we've got a terminal disease and it's slowly shutting down our nervous system and our body is going to be crippled by it and it's going to affect every area of our life. And we just go, no. It's a really serious thing, sin. We're not to compare ourselves to people that we think are doing horrific things. That's not what the Bible sets up as a standard. Our standard is to compare ourselves to God himself, to Jesus himself. And one of the ways that I understand this is through cooking, actually. I'm not very good at cooking, but my signature dish is spaghetti bolognese. And so I know how to buy dormio, I know how to buy mince, and I know how to mix them together. And for a long time, I thought I could make a pretty good spaghetti bolognese. And then I remember there was a time I took my wife out on a date, and we went to Jamie Oliver's Italian. And we're sitting there in Jamie's Italian restaurant, and I thought, I will try Jamie's spaghetti bolognese. And so I ordered some of his spag bol, and I remember arriving, and it smelled great, and I took a forkful, and I put it in my mouth. And up until that moment, I thought that I had been making spaghetti bolognese. And I realized in that moment that what I had in fact been making was diarrhea in a pan. Because in comparison to Jamie Oliver's spaghetti bolognese, that's what mine tastes like. And when it comes to, am I living a good life or am I living a sinful life? The standard is not, I'm going to compare myself to other people in the world that are doing terrible things. It's no, we look to Jesus. We compare our lives with his. And so often in the scripture, when people come into the presence of Jesus, they come into the presence of holiness, we begin to realize how much of a mess we have made in our lives. And for the different ones of us, this will hit us at different moments. But there will come moments. Maybe it's when you're lying in a bath one night. Maybe it's when you're sitting on a bus one day. Maybe it's just when a relationship has gone wrong. But there'll come moments when we realize that we actually, if we're really honest with ourselves, intentionally and deliberately hurt other people. We don't do it all the time, but we have an amazing capacity to cause other people pain. And we do it. That is sin. And we owe God a debt. And so the first part of the Christian story, it doesn't sound like good news. It's like, oh, okay, so I owe this absolutely massive, crushing debt. But then the story goes on. And what Jesus says through this guy is he says the king sees this debt and then he cancels it. And just again, imagine what that must be like. The biggest financial debt that I owe is my mortgage. So we bought a house a few years ago in Watford, and we did it with Nationwide, and the only way we could get a mortgage was if we got a 35-year mortgage. So I have this massive mortgage. And so I'll go on my online banking and I'll see, I've got a little bit of money in my current account, and then I'll look at my mortgage and it's just minus thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, and I won't be paying off until I'm 60. And so that's terrifying. And yet we've got the house and we love the house, and so we've done some stuff to the house. We've kind of done a bit of DIY. Beth makes me kind of put mirrors up, and then I put them up and she's not happy because they're a little bit wonky, and so I have to redo it all over again, and I get exasperated. But let's say one day the bank manager of Nationwide calls me down and says, Mr. Croft, we need to chat. And I go down to Nationwide and kind of was sitting there at his desk, and he says, look, I'm so sorry about this, but I'm going to have to kind of call the mortgage in, and if you can't pay it, I'm going to have to repossess your house. How would I respond? How would you respond? If that happened to you, you would be like, can you give me some more time? Can you give me maybe 35 years more time? I'll get you the money. But if he's not budging, and then what I would do is I would get down on my knees and I would say, please, Mr. Bank Manager, please, seriously, you don't realize how annoyed Beth is going to be if I go home and tell her we have to live on the streets. We've just had a baby, for crying out loud. Let me give you, look at the photos. Have some compassion. If at that moment, when I'm down on my knees in front of that bank manager, a look of compassion did come over his face, and he suddenly just said to me, do you know what, Mr. Croft? Actually, what we'll do is we'll just write the mortgage off, and you can keep the house. How would I respond? I would do what everybody else would do. I would get off my knees, and I would snog that bank manager. I would kiss him all over his face. I would run out into the street and I would start screaming, yes, Nationwide, yes, Nationwide, yes, Nationwide. I knew there was a reason that I chose you. Why? Because in a moment and in an instant, in a single sentence, a whole lifetime's worth of debt has been taken away. Do we realize that's what happens when we come to know him? A whole lifetime's worth of debt washed away. And sometimes it's hard to understand and it's hard to quantify the mercy of God. In Psalm 103, it talks about how as far as the east is from the west, so far has God removed our transgressions, our sins from us. How far is the east from the west? It's as far as we can get. I've used this before on God Speaks Today, but if we were to compare God's mercy to water, for example, Sometimes what we do is we think of it as like a little glass that we take a sip of, and there's a limited supply of it, and it's like, oh my word, it's going to run out. I have a little sip, but there's not that much mercy left now because I've messed up a few things, and it's going to run out at some stage. That's how we think of God's mercy. We relate to it as a limited thing, as something small. We can think of his mercy like a drop, and it's like we have to wring it out of him, and I have to squeeze a bit of mercy out of him, and that's not how it is. Do you know how it is? We are the drop, and his mercy is like the ocean. And we fall into that. If we were to understand his mercy as the ocean, think about it like, I remember seeing this thing on the BBC where it's talking about how much water there is in the world. If you were to get all the water in the oceans in the world and put them into bathtubs and line them up, some sad person in the BBC studio worked this out, and line them up from Earth lengthways to the sun and back again, you'd have enough bathtubs to cover that 81 million times. If you were to drain the oceans by putting a normal plug hole, apparently, it would take 174 trillion years to drain the water out of the oceans. His mercy is like an ocean. If we really wanted to ram this home, let's say we all got on a plane together. Come on, let's get on a plane. We flew across the Pacific Ocean, the biggest ocean in the world. And while we were flying there, suddenly, as we all sat there, the back of the plane went down. And I was shouting over the engines, we think his mercy is like a little glass of water. And we don't realize it's like the ocean. And you could see it far beneath. And I said, we think his mercy is like this little drop that we have to squeeze out. But what we don't realize is that we're the drop and we fall into the ocean. And then just to prove my point, I picked up one of the people that were there, one of the people I didn't like, and I threw them off the back of the plane. That's a joke, I like them, but I still throw them off the back of the plane. And they are plummeting down to the Pacific Ocean. And as they're falling, as you're falling, imagine it's you, and you look to the right and to the left, you see as far as the horizon stretches, just water everywhere. You see that it goes from as far as the east to the west, and you're plummeting down, and you realize that you are but a speck of dust. You are but a grain of sand. You are just this tiny little thing that is about to be immersed completely in the ocean. At that point, when you understand that sort of quantity, we begin to get close to understanding the amount of mercy that he has for us. And that can sound, I understand, that can sound like flowery language, can't it? That can just sound like fancy words until we realize that this mercy has a concrete face and that he was born 2,000 years ago. And that the debt that we're talking about isn't this abstract financial thing. This is a real spiritual debt. And whenever a debt is paid, someone has to absorb the cost. Debts aren't just wiped out. So if I lend you 10 quid and then you want to give it back to me and I say, don't worry about it, that doesn't mean the 10 quid has ceased to have meaning and just disappeared. It means I absorb the cost of that £10 myself. When the king cancels the £5.2 billion debt, he's absorbing that cost into his own economy. So someone always pays for a debt. And what Jesus is doing when he dies on the cross is he's paying our debt. What we deserve, death, because the wages of sin are death. What we deserve to be separated from God for the things that we've done, he takes on himself in that moment. And the thing that he cries out on the cross is this little phrase, it is finished. If you were to go to Marketplace back in the day, in the time of Jesus, you would see that they would stamp debts that had been paid with a particular phrase. And it can be translated, it is finished. He's saying the debt is settled, the debt is paid. To be a Christian is to discover this astonishingly good news. I owe something so massive, and yet he loves me enough to give me what I don't deserve. And then the story goes on. And of course, this guy leaves the room, having understood that he's just had this amazing debt cancelled. He leaves the room and he finds another guy and he grabs him and he says, give me what you owe me. And it's only when we understand the story of the gospel in our guts that we're able to live out the mercy that God encourages us to live out. Let me just find, there's this little verse that you can discover. Where is it? I think it's in 2 Peter, but I've got it somewhere in my notes. It says, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And the point is, as we receive mercy, we're to be shaped by it. Think about it, if you ever buy a little nephew or niece or something like a costume for Christmas, they generally love it, don't they? So they dress up like Spider-Man or they dress up like Superman, and they have their dinner in the costume, and they go to bed in the costume, and they have a bath in the costume. And they just they take that on as an identity for a while. And in the same way, when we become Christians, it's like we receive mercy as a gift, but then also it's to become our identity. It's to become something that we take on. We are born again into forgiveness. And then that forgiveness is meant to define the way that we live. And Jesus is speaking so strongly to those of us who know him, but are refusing to give mercy out to the people around us who hurt us. We're to receive mercy, but to give it. And that's really hard. That is really tough. Our natural disposition, generally, if somebody hurts us, is not to forgive them. Or maybe that's just me. We all have different ways of coping. Some of us will get moody, some of us will get angry, some of us will just kind of shove it all down. We won't let them know, but inside we'll be so fuming, And Jesus says that's not how you're to live, you're to forgive. And one question I have is, well, Lord, how does that work? How am I meant to do it? Why are you so strong on it? The guy gets thrown in jail at the end for not doing it. And one of the reasons why I think Jesus is so strong on this and so clear about it is because to not forgive somebody imprisons us. It traps us. Think about it like this. If somebody stabbed me and I just went around holding the knife in, would that be a good way to heal? If someone hurts us and we don't forgive, that's what we're doing. We're just holding it in there. And we are always going to be hurt. To think we can walk around human beings and not get hurt is like thinking you can walk through a field full of stinging nettles and not get stung. We're going to get hurt. People are going to, it's not right, but they are going to betray us. They're going to hurt us. They're going to do things they shouldn't do to us. And we are within our rights to say that that's wrong. This servant did owe the other guy £7,000 and he should have paid him back. So he was within his rights to demand it. But what God says to us is, in the light of what you've received, in the light of this enormous debt that you've just had paid, you give that mercy away. And what we see is that forgiveness, ultimately, it sets us free. You'll be familiar with Nelson Mandela. He died not that long ago. And his funeral was obviously this incredible event, a great celebration of a life well lived. But he spent so much of that life living in jail. 21 years he was on Robben Island for fighting against apartheid. If you read his autobiography, he describes how there's this one particular time where he's holding his daughter for the first time in 16 years. I mean, can you imagine that? Not being able to hold your own child for 16 years because you're fighting against something that's totally unjust in the first place. And yet in that place, he refused to allow unforgiveness to imprison him. So he constantly lived out of a place of forgiveness. When he finally was let out and he became the president of South Africa, then he had as his guest of honor at that kind of big feast, his jailer. His jailer was there as his guest of honor. The time on Robben Island has been called Mandela University by some, because it was in that place that Nelson Mandela taught the other leaders of the ANC that to forgive was better than to hold a grudge. And so what it meant is, by the time they came out, there were enough graduates of Mandela University to bring healing and to bring restoration to that place, South Africa. When we don't forgive, we just become imprisoned. And if I was hearing this and I was hurt, I know the first question I would have is, well, it's not that easy. You don't understand what's been done to me. To forgive isn't to say it didn't matter. But it is to absorb a cost. It's not to say, this is no big deal, but it is to let yourself stop feeling bitter and stop holding a grudge. How do you do it? A couple of practical things. First of all, it's a decision of the will. It's not always about a feeling. And even if you feel like, okay, well, I don't want to do this, you can decide, Lord, I want to do it. I decide that this is the path that I'm going to tread. The second thing about forgiveness is it's a journey. So often it doesn't happen just in one moment all the time. And so what I've done at times is I've forgiven somebody, and then the next time I see them again, it's like all the pain comes up and all the feelings come back, and I have to forgive them again and again and again. But it's a journey that does have an end point. And the final thing with this is a real battle for you, and I understand if it is ask him for help. Ask God to help. I chatted to this one guy who was from northern Nigeria, And he was telling me about some of the persecution that they've been through in northern Nigeria. And I remember him showing, there was a group of us, some slides of his family at the start. And one of them, one of the people that he was looking after was his niece. And then he went on to tell some stories about how people he knew had been killed in one way or the other, some of them through letter bombs. They'd literally gone to pick up a parcel at Christmas and they'd been blown up. Others, entire families had been massacred. He talked about a little baby that he showed us had a machete scar on their head, and they had been the only survivor, and the other 8 children had been massacred, people attacking them because they're Christians. And I remember putting my hand up at the end of all of this, and I just said to this guy, how can you forgive people? You know, when they do that stuff to you, how can you do it? I don't know if I could. And then he said, he hadn't told us this up until this point, then he said, do you know this, my niece that I showed you in the photo, he said, the reason she's living with us is because my brother was murdered by people that hate Christians. And so we're now looking after her. And then he said, honestly, it's hard. And it was a wrestle. And it took me a long time to get to that place. But he said, there came a moment when I was in a school classroom and there was a little wooden cross in the middle of the floor, and I knelt down. And at that point, I was able to let it go as I knelt at the foot of the cross in the light of what had been done for him. And then he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, how can I forgive, Andy? By the grace of God. By the grace of God. Ask him for help. It's by his grace. What we do is we get together and we tell stories about the God that many of us already know. And then we live from that story again and again and again. The story is this: we owed a debt that we could never pay. He paid it on our behalf, and we receive mercy, that which we don't deserve. And as a result of that, he calls us, all of us, to be a people of mercy. This is God Speaks Today. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.